Later. I'm one of the leaders of our Parks and Green Space work group. And I'm going to be introducing our speaker for the day, Jeanette Gustat, who's one of the other leaders. She's not actually going to be on the call today. She's in New Orleans, and they have, I mean, if you've been watching the news, they got hit by a hurricane yesterday. She was pretty sure they weren't going to have any power, that she didn't know where she was going to be today. Hopefully they, didn't get too much damage from the storm, and she's doing all right. Rich, did you want to just introduce yourself quickly for those who might not know you?
Sure, Rich Christiana from Appalachian State University.
And Rich is also, he's one of our co-leads in the Parks and Green Space work group. So we also want to introduce our new fellow, Jamiel. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes, but I prefer Jem.
Okay. And Jem, do you want to just, you're at Tulane, right?
Yes, I am a PhD candidate from Tulane University.
Great. So I'm going to do a quick introduction of Robby Layton, who's going to be our speaker today, and then we can kind of give some updates at the end after we have some questions in regards to in regards to Robby's presentation, and then we can wrap up. So Robby Layton he's actually been a member of Parks and Green Space now for a number of years. And he's going to be giving us a presentation entitled Measuring Parks and Park Systems for Community Health. Robby got his Master of Landscape Architecture from University of Colorado, Denver, and his PhD in Design from North Carolina State University. He's a founding member of the firm Design Concepts, which is a national landscape architecture and planning firm. And he's also a member of the GP Red Operating Board and is involved with research on the intersection of landscape and community health. So welcome, Robby. Thank you so much for agreeing to give this presentation today.
Thanks a lot. Glad to see everybody. And thank you for inviting me to talk today on this topic. I guess I'll just dive right into it here and I'll try to get into the screen sharing. Hope this works. Let's see here. Let me know, are you guys seeing the presentation now?
Yes. Yep.
Good. That's a good start. All right. So what I want to talk today about is as was just said, parks as medicine and measuring the strength of them as a medicine. I was already introduced with my affiliations here. I'll clarify just a little bit. So I was a founding member of the firm of Design Concepts. I was a past president of that firm and principal for 37 years, but 2 years ago, I sold my interest, my original founding partner and I sold our interest to our employees. So while I'm associated with the firm, I'm really not that actively involved in it anymore. But a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about today was developed during practice at that firm, and then refined during my research for my dissertation at North Carolina State. Although what I'm going to show you today was not really part of my dissertation, it was something I did as part of another class. And then now today that work is being carried on through GP Red in terms of applying the things that I'm going to be talking about today. Basically are applied through GP Red's initiatives. So I'll tell you a little more about that too. Let's see here. So I think in this group in particular, we all agree that parks are good medicine that can be used to treat a variety of things caused by today's really lifestyle and our environments. But like other types of, like medications and other types of treatments, they're not all the same. All parks are not the same. Each park, in my approach to this, is a unique formulation of ingredients. It's the I'm looking at the ingredients in a park, and and like a medication, medicines are made of active ingredients and inactive ingredients. And so it's that combination of things that makes each one unique and different from others in terms of their strength and their effectiveness. So I'm going to go with this medicine analogy today, but I tell people that by the time I'm done, you're going to be sick of my analogy of parks as medicine. Now let's look at the active ingredients. What are the active ingredients in a medication? Well, active ingredients in a medication are the things that make it easier to administer. I'm sorry, they're the things that produce the desired effect. They're the things that the active ingredients are what creates the effect that you're after when you apply that medication or treatment. Comparing that to a park, you can look at a park and say a park is made up of all these different things. Parks made up of different, I call them components. If you look at all the components of parks, you'll see that some of them are things that are deliberately intended to bring people to that park to engage in something, to come there for a purpose. And that includes things like play spaces and the paths and sports courts. It can also include passive spaces, things like just maybe a dock, fishing dock, or just a wayside where you might sit and enjoy the immersion in nature. So these are all active features. The active features of a park being the things that bring people there for a purpose. That's what they come to the park for. And that's what I consider the active ingredients in a park. The inactive ingredients to a park, in my analogy, are the things that, like inactive ingredients in a medication, make it easier to administer or more convenient. It's in some ways, it's the spoonful of sugar that makes the medicine go down. And in a park, that's things like having shade and a place just to sit and rest, having a restroom and drinking water, the things that allow you to stay longer, providing parking, perhaps food to eat or refreshments while you're there, just pleasant scenery. All those kinds of things are these inactive ingredients in a park that I call modifiers. That's a term I'll use on this, because those things modify the experience that you go. So if you go there to play on a playground, the value that you take from that playground and your experience of it will be modified by the presence of these modifiers. Whether if there's shade and a place to sit, you might stay at the playground longer. If there's a restroom, you can stay longer. Those kind of things, and you'll get more enjoyment while you're there. So those are what I call modifiers or inactive ingredients in this medicine analogy. Like most treatments, the dosage is a function of three main things: frequency, how often you are exposed to that treatment, the duration of that exposure, and the intensity of it. And the first two things in a park are relatively easy to measure, right? You can measure how often someone goes there. You can measure how long they stay. But a real question is, how do we measure the intensity of their visit? So I'm going to offer my interpretation of that, an application of that, how we look at intensity in a park.
Robby,
so you can see, yeah.
Robby, one quick thing, sorry. It doesn't seem like your slides are advancing. So I think we're just seeing the first slide measuring the
anybody know a solution for that?
I don't. Are you currently doing the slideshow? This is a PowerPoint, correct?
I'm in PowerPoint. I'm in the viewer. It came up in the viewer view. I mean, the presenter view.
Presenter view. I think you should be able to, when you do the share screen, switch and choose which shared screen you want to use. So you might have to unshare, or you usually can reshare your screen.
How about now if I do
That's
this?
Perfect. Awesome.
You see now,
Yep.
Good. We're gonna run these real quick. Here's my
Awesome. Thank
medicine
you.
analogy. So there's the analogy of medicine that you're gonna get sick of the medicine analogy. Here's the description of the active ingredients. As I said, active ingredients are the things that people go there to participate in, to do something. It's what draws them there in the first place. And then these are the inactive ingredients, the modifiers, that are things that support those activities. And then here's the example I was just talking about. where we have two examples. These are hypothetical, these are photoshopped images, but it just shows you that this exact same playground structure is the same in both pictures, but the modifiers, the inactive ingredients, the playground is an active ingredient. You're going to come there and play on the playground, but the inactive ingredients are these things like shade and having restrooms nearby and a pleasant surroundings and a place to sit. So the question being, which of these parks is likely to provide a healthier dose of fun, right? So the question then really, as I said, is we can measure frequency and duration relatively easily. How do we measure the intensity of a park? What kind of measures can we apply to measure the intensity of an exposure in a park? And so this is what I've come up with and we've applied in various ways. And this is, I'll say this is, it was made as a management tool as opposed necessarily to a research tool. We've used it mostly as a management tool for park agencies, land managers, decision makers, political bodies that make decisions about funding and management of parks and other lands. So the way I got here is developing an index that rates the potential of a park to generate physical activity within the community. And it's something that I've referred to as a GRASP active index. It's because it's based on this GRASP inventory tool and some other measurement tools that my firm Design Concepts developed with Greenplay over the years. And we've applied for almost 20 years now, actually 20 years this year. We've been using the GRASP tool set of methods to assess parks and then use them in measuring park systems. So based on that and some literature review to determine what's the literature have to say about these things, and then focusing on, in this case, on indicators for physical activity, using a proposed metric to come up with an index that should measure the propensity of a place to generate physical activity. And then testing that in a case study that I did while I was in a class at NC State. And then we've since evaluated that tool by applying it in a number of places through GP Red's Research, Education, and Development wing by doing fee-for-service projects. So as I said, to reiterate, the active ingredients are the things that people come there to do, and we can look at those and assess those based on their functionality. How well do they serve their intended purpose? That's what the GRASP tool has done all these years. It's a way to audit a park and assess how well does a particular feature or component meet its expectations for functionality. Does it function as it was intended to in that place? And the tool assesses that. The inactive ingredients, shade, parking, those kinds of things are assessed at a park or site level for the entire site, because the presence of those things at a site then in this model modifies the value of those active ingredients. So that together, those form the formulation of a park. So again, looking at the audit tool, you can see that what I call components in this case is the playground that's out there. So the component is what people came there to actually, it drew them there. They came there to utilize. The inactive ingredients are the things that support that use and activity, make it more pleasant, make it more desirable, more comfortable and convenient to use. I also put in here something that Jay was involved with. I worked with Myron Floyd and others at NC State on developing this active energy expenditure assessment. And so that's been rolled into this index. And what it does is look at for a given feature within a park, it looked at the amount of metabolic energy expended over, energy expended over basic metabolic rates to determine how much these things generate physical activity within the community. And that included everyone in the space. So in the dog park, it includes the people standing or walking or whatever they're doing, or just sitting there with their dogs. Or in the playground, includes everybody within that space, whether it's caretakers, parents, whatever, and the kids themselves. Same thing with the soccer field. the energy expenditure was measured by everyone who was in that space to determine an index or a relative amount of energy expended for that feature. So I've rolled that into this index and kind of reverse coded it, did some other things to it, but pulled it into this index here. So I'll give you an example here of how this might work. So if we start with the active ingredients, we could simply create a metric that just says if the active ingredients are going to generate physical activity, then we just count them up. So here we just, we say we got one playground, maybe we have 2 ball fields, maybe we have 4 tennis courts at this hypothetical park, maybe there's other features of basketball court, skate park, picnic areas, etc. And we come up with a score, which on my screen, the score is actually hidden by your guys' faces. So, but I got it right here. It's 13 in this case. So that would be a basic measure, right? We could use that measure. Say the more things there are to do, the more people are likely to come and do them. And we would have a number to evaluate a park on this against another one. More things would be a higher score. But we can refine this by adding in this functionality score from the GRASP assessment tool. So it's basically a 3-point scale. If something functions as it's expected at that location, for example, if it does what in our assessment it was intended to do, whether it's a playground, a tennis court, or whatever, if it basically meets that functionality, it gets a 2. If it exceeds that functionality in some way, it's more desirable, it exceeds expectations, it would get a 3. If it doesn't meet expectations, it's below, either because it's obsolete, maybe it's not of the right capacity, it's in the wrong place, or something about it that it just doesn't work as well as it should under what we consider normal local expectations. And there's a whole way we get at local expectations in doing that, and they do vary from place to place. But that number 1, 2, 3 becomes a modifier score in the index. So we can apply that. And now when we combine the number of components with the actual functionality of each of those, we come up with another hypothetical score here for this particular park. And we can use that to differentiate it from another one somewhere. But here's where we roll in the active energy expenditure ratings. And we say, okay, what we've done is taken a 1, 2, or 3 on those. Things that generate more physical activity in the community get a higher rating. So here we've taken for each of these components and put a number for the physical activity generation of that component on it. So now we get another more refined score for this particular park. We continue that and say, okay, park quality, the quality of the overall park. These are the inactive ingredients. If we throw in a number for the inactive ingredients here, which in this case are these modifiers, and we have a way of measuring the value of those, assessing the value of those in our audit tool. If we take those and we kind of roll that into, and each park would have a modifier index. I won't go into detail how we get to that, but let's assume in this particular hypothetical park, our modifier index was 4.8. Then that would generate a new score for the park. Lastly, there's the literature talks, there's inconclusive evidence in the literature about this idea of quantity. Does more green space equal more physical activity? And I've seen the literature being, there's some different outcomes on that. So I put it in here. And so here it is. You put a acreage factor in there, then you get a really big number. But you'll get, varying numbers from, depending on the size of the park, quite a spread, but you'll get another number. So now we have a number, an index number that I call the GRASP active value. So in this case, we have a GRASP active value in this hypothetical park of this 6,350. So what do we do with that? So I did just an initial kind of a case study. I had data on all of Cary, North Carolina's parks from having done a GRASP assessment of them as part of their park and recreation system master plan. So I used that data. I plugged all that data into a table and then added in, ran it through this formula that I just showed you. And I came up with this list of, these are all the parks in Cary that were assessed. And then that last one is a score for them, but I converted it to log 10 because of these numbers. I thought that would make it a little more meaningful than having these huge range of numbers. And that big size range comes mainly from the acreage number. So I plugged it in, generated these values. Okay, now my computer is locked up. It's not going anywhere. Here we go. And then I ran it through some statistical analysis just to see what these main variables, to see what that size variable, the active energy expenditure variable, and a couple other things we're doing in the equation, and found that for Cary, the active energy expenditure was the most significant contributor to the results, which seemed to make sense. We're kind of after that physical activity number, but we're modifying it by the park, the attributes of the park itself. And you can see the size was relatively insignificant, which is good because the size thing is, as I said, I think there's some uncertainty in the literature about what the contribution of the amount of acreage is to green space effects. For some reason it's not advancing on that. Okay, anyway, I'm getting it to go now. So the scores, I took and bracketed them into just a high, medium, and low, just to get a relative value on those. So I could again code those in the highest third, middle third, and the lowest third in terms of these scores that were generated for each park. So now we can use those in the GIS. We can apply those to each park. So this diagram shows 3 parks and with a score for that park, whether it's high, medium, or low, or 1, 2, and 3, applied to a buffer around it. And that buffer, can be different things. My study, I use a 1/3 mile buffer. It has to do with the way I've assessed walkability on just a radial buffer. And you can see that, what different parks under this outcome have different scores in terms of their grasp index. Their active grasp active index. So we apply that to that buffer, and then we can map it out. And we get maps like the one on the left here, which shows the shaded values across the geography for proximity to these parks. So where the shades are darker, there's a higher total value of access to these grasp active index values. And of course, they overlap when you're in proximate to multiple parks. So you can see on the left there, you can see what the actual values are. Then sort of putting those in a threshold yields the picture on the right. I just have a quick question. Are you guys seeing your faces covering half the screen? Good. I realized, I'm sharing my screen. Yours might look just like mine. And I see all of you covering my right half of the screen. What I don't see really is the picture that's underneath it that has yellow and purple circles. But what that is saying if we assume a threshold of some kind, then we can begin use this as a management tool to say, where are things acceptable? Where are things okay in the geography of Cary? Where is access low or non-existent to these kind of features that would generate some physical activity in the community based on this walkable proximity? So that's how it begins to become a management tool. There are other ways too. These scores could be used, but this is one way to do it at the system level, moving from an individual park into the idea of a park system, which is really what a lot of my work has been about in terms of my practice side of planning. I've also designed a lot of parks. So in the design side, we could use these scores to come at some targets or goals when designing a park as to what we're trying to achieve in terms of this grasp active value, and then have different alternatives to get there. And we could assess those alternatives. Maybe we have 3 designs for a park. This would be one tool to assess which design performs better on that particular performance measure. So those are the kinds of things we can do. But here's applying it to the park system or citywide level, just to see what's going on in the city based on access and proximity to these values. So here's the first sort of real beta site, I'll call it. City of Golden, Colorado about 5 years ago, wanted to update their Parks and Recreation Master Plan, but they wanted to do it with these health values in mind. That was a specific goal of their park system update. And so they asked if we'd use this measure and try, you go ahead and use it in their community, and we did. So this was kind of our first real use of this thing as applying it to practice. And so here's what we came up with in Golden. This is a map of Golden, Colorado. You can see the darker shades representing where these grasp active values are higher, and then where they're lower based on the lighter shades. And then there's a little summary. If you live there near downtown, right in the middle here, it shows what you have access to, all these different features. Whereas if you live maybe down here, you won't have near as much. So then we combine that with some of the demographic data, and we began to look at, who lived there, who lived in these gap areas. And so, we looked at where those shades were lighter and figured, did somebody live there? Because sometimes you'll have these light shades happening where no one lives at all. So it's really not a problem. But depending on who lives in these gap areas, we can tell how important or how critical it is to do these things. So we we identified these 3 particular gap areas to look at in more detail. And then this is a better explanation of how that greater detail works. I'm going to jump to a different project. When we moved to this second time we applied this was in Arlington Heights, to the Arlington Heights Park District. So we did some more things with the demographics. I'll explain a little bit here, where we developed an index for the population in any given area. So in Arlington Heights, we went through the same process of generating this heat map here, this shaded values map, really you can see it real small, and then using that to determine an average for the entire community. And then the community was broken down into 5 planning sub areas. I don't remember how they were developed. It was something the city wanted to look at. That was their planning units that they use. So we used their planning units to look at these sub areas. So for each of these 5 sub areas, Camelot, Frontier, Recreation, Pioneer, and Heritage, we developed a participation index. And it's based on looking at this little graph here of red things shows that we looked at 10 different activities, and we can get data from Esri on the rates of participation in these activities within either the entire community, basically any geographic sub area. You can draw a line on a map or draw a polygon on a map, and Esri will return back to you these data on participation. They're, I'm not sure exactly how they get it, to be honest with you, but I have a thing it has a lot to do with sales information and other things like that. But anyway, you have this map that shows for the entire Arlington Heights community, what are the participation rates? Obviously, walking up here at the top was the highest one. And then of the 10, the lowest one, the lower ones were down here, like I think disc golf or Frisbee was the lowest. We can then compare, whoops, now I got to figure out how to go back. We can then compare them for these sub areas, those same rates to the sub areas, and where what we did was map out where if participation in an activity was greater than the citywide average, then it scored a point on that. So you can get up to 10 points for each of these sub areas based on whether they're above or below the whole citywide average of participation on those. You can see this area up here called Camelot, appropriately named, has the highest participation rates, people doing the most things. The lowest, I believe, was down here, right here, misnamed Recreation. They called this the Recreation Sub-District, and it was actually the lowest participation rate in these recreation activities. So we were able to take those things and use them. So like I said, first off, we start with the intensity map. We map out the intensity of this grasp active variable or index across the city and within these small sub areas, smaller sub areas. And we come up with an average for each of those. So we have a citywide average, and then we have an average for each of the 5 subunits. Then we use this participation index developing, as I said, where the red indicates whether something's above or below And then for each one of those, we have a score, a value in the index. It can be from 0 to 10 index for participation. And then we put them in this graph right here. And so looking a little closer at that graph, and we graphed this on the left, our grasp active index across the community on the x-axis, and then these participation indexes on the y-axis. And here's how they laid out. So in these we had these 4 quadrants. So if we look at the quadrants, you can see 2 of these sub areas are up here. Camelot, as I said, appropriately named, high level of participation, but it also correlated with a high number of participation, high participation rate with a high value on the highest of the 5 sub areas in terms of this grasp active index. And then we have down here on the low end, well, let's just take these quadrants one at a time. So when we have this situation for these 2, we have high participation and high service, level of service, then we can assume that things are working as they should. And the strategy from a management standpoint is maintain those conditions, monitor the conditions to make sure that that continues to be the case, that there's adequate features, adequate level of service of things to do, and that people are participating in them. We didn't have any in this upper left quadrant where we would have had perhaps high access to things, high value of service, but low participation. If that were the case, our recommendation would have been to provide more programs and activities, not to build more parks, but to look at how do you get people into those parks doing things. So likewise, we didn't have any in the lower right where we have people doing lots of things and yet the level of service is low. Now we could look at why that is. We haven't, and say, well, is this correlation kind of making sense that when there's not as much to do, people aren't doing as much? We could get into why these conditions exist as they do, but we're just using them as a management tool. So if we were here where people were actually doing lots of things on the participation index, but the level of service was low, we'd say we need more parks, more places for them to go, providing things closer to home. And finally, this is where we would put our priority in a study like this, where we have low participation and we have low access to things. So we would begin to say, well, we need to use a blended approach. Not only do we need to provide more parks and features, but we need to make sure that people know they're there. We need an awareness campaign, perhaps we need some programming that gets people out there into those spaces and utilizing them. So this is really the recommendation in Arlington Heights, is to focus on these 3 areas and figure out how we can improve both the level of service and the participation rates. So we've gone on and done this in more cases through GP Red. And for example, Fruita, Colorado and the city of Tulsa are 2 of the pretty recent ones that we've worked on through what we call the Healthy Communities Research Group of GP Red. The Healthy Community Research Group does these kind of things in these particular cases as fee-for-service kind of projects where we can do this and do the study forward or move forward on the knowledge base of it, use these things in these ways to try to understand these things better and help these communities thrive and move them forward through these funded park and recreation healthy communities plans. And we've done other ones that don't utilize necessarily this approach, but maybe they focus more on healthy eating activities or recreation activities, but there's a variety of different types of healthy communities plans that GP Red has done. But the one I showed you here really is utilizing this an index to make measurements of parks and compare them to one another, aggregate them to look at the geography across the entire community. If you want to see a little more, get a little more detail on this stuff, we've just recently released these 3 research briefs. The first one just kind of talking about what is a park, because through my research, what I found is the word park is thrown around kind of loosely, and especially in the research world, in my opinion. A lot of research studies talked about parks without really saying what they mean by a park. And different people mean different things when they say park. So that research brief talks about that sort of situation and proposes some ways of addressing that. And then these other two kind of go through the assessment tool for measuring the value of a park space based on these components and modifiers. And then the third one shows how to apply those at the citywide or regional geographic level to look at systems. And there's a link in here to, if you wanted to do it. And then finally, I would propose that with further research, maybe a similar approach could be applied to look at some other health values. This is just very, this is just an illustration is all this is. I said, well, what if we could look at, what if we could assign mental, social, environmental health, economic health, these other health variables? What if we could assign an index on those to these parks? And I just sort of hypothetically did that, plotted it out in this chart just to see how in Cary, how different the parks might be under that scenario. So you can see we do get a way to differentiate parks from one from another. And that affects, again, the management implications of how you manage those spaces, how you get people to and from them, which ones you should perhaps provide transit to, let's say, for example. You can look at a lot of management decisions based on these values if we could begin to measure those. This is some of the references from this report, and this is the conclusion of my presentation for you guys. Is everybody there?
Yeah, thanks, Robby. That was great. Does anyone have any questions for Robby? So, well, I have one question to maybe start us off while other people are thinking about what questions they might have and digesting a little bit more of the information you provided. There was a lot of information, Robby. So you showed a number of communities that you've worked with where you've presented this information. Do you have any results of them, like taking your recommendations and showing, like, mapping it out and showing them where there might be deficits in their park and recreation systems, and how they've changed it, and what the outcomes of that might be?
The best example I have is the Golden, because it was the first, as I said, the first time it was applied in practice. And it's been about 5 years now, I believe, 2016, I think. Yeah, 16 was when that plan was done. And they have proceeded to utilize the plan in providing new parks. So it's helped them determine where to provide some new parks and how to configure what to put in those parks and how to tailor the amenities of those to the particular demographics of those sub areas. So I know Golden has been, how do I say this? I think they're happy with that. They're utilizing it. And the reason I know that is because Rod Tarullo is the parks director there. And Rod and I co-presented at NRPA in 2019, a couple of years ago. We co-presented. And so Rod talked about how Golden is utilizing these things in their parks and recreation system planning now.
So I have one other question, and then it looks like we might have a question in chat. So as a follow-up to that, so you showed how you use the ESRI data to identify like how active people are, and you showed a lot of the demographics on the parks. Have you overlaid it with like community level demographics to try and see if there's certain populations in the community that might have unequal access to parks, so that that's exactly what the Golden map did. Yeah, that map I showed for Golden, that I showed those key sub areas, it came from that analysis. So okay, that's exactly what we did. So
And-
like, but for the community characteristics, like, so do you look at like race, ethnicity,
Yes,
socioeconomic
yes, that was what I
status?
meant in Golden, yes.
Okay,
Yeah, we did not have the participation index in Golden. We simply looked at those variables that you're talking about to look
Okay.
for need. I would call it need based on that. What are the most disadvantaged communities in Golden, and where does that intersect with low levels of service? And then, as I said, what Golden has since done is then moved into using Esri's data to help as another set of information to use when planning what to do in those areas. And they have developed a couple new parks and some other things associated, based on what they learned from this. Yeah, and both those sociological demographics and those participation demographics.
okay, great. And then it looks like Elsa has a question. She wants to ask, if in this study or another, have you considered indicators of appropriation parks in particular?
By that, I'm going to appropriation meaning, I'm not sure how appropriation is being used in this question.
Elsa, can you please clarify?
Yes, it's like a social embedded of parks that how can the persons has a preference of this park and he has to be there the most time. I don't know.
Yeah, preferences. In other words, individual.
Attachment.
Yeah,
Yes, individual or in group appropriation.
So if I understand your question right, are we basically looking at individual or cultural preferences perhaps, or other preferences that someone may have in that particular community or part of the community? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, yes. In each neighborhood, you can see a kind of specific type of appropriation, and it's different between another neighborhood.
Got it. Yeah. How do we know we're providing appropriate things, or what are the appropriate things to do? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah. So part of this process that I didn't really talk about is how a lot of I went back to this idea of expectations within each community. The expectations piece comes from a lot of public process. So in Golden, for example, while all this assessment was going on, simultaneously were a whole series of public meetings, this public facilitation process, allowing people from these different communities and going into these different communities to talk about what's important to them, what do they see as the strengths and weaknesses in their neighborhood, those kinds of things. So that piece is also combined. And through that's part of the way we get in the assessment tool at what we call local expectations. The example I always use of that is a long time ago, I did a park system master plan using this assessment tool for Washington, D.C., in the District of Columbia. And the National Capital Mall had, I think, like 15 softball fields. Believe it or not, the National Capital Mall is 15, however many softball fields. And the expectation, even though there's no backstops, there's no skinned infields, there's none of that stuff. Basically, people go play out on the grass and play out on the lawn and play softball. And there's a number, when I was there was lots of softball games going on. They may not still be doing that, I don't know. This was about 10 to 15 years ago. And I thought, in Denver, Colorado, which I've also done a study of recreational fields for Denver, that wouldn't fly. The expectation in Denver is a softball field has a backstop and it has skin infield and it has certain things. That's just the expectation. And if it doesn't have those things, it is considered substandard. On the National Capital Mall in Washington, D.C., those fields that have none of those things were considered fine. They met expectations. So they would score accordingly in this system assessment that those fields met expectations in Washington, D.C. They would not necessarily meet expectations in another place and would be scored lower. So there's a whole facilitation process that goes on to get at what people's expectations are, what their priorities and preferences are. And all that's being done simultaneous with just this direct observation data.
Robbie, kind of similar to that, is that all then mixed in with issues of perception of safety and I'm thinking racial discrimination that can happen in those spaces, or are those part of some of the observation aspects in terms of those inactive features and then become modifiers of the actual use?
That's a real good question. And the answer is sort of. I would say that one of the things that's not strongly codified in the metric are actual, for example, anything to do with the surrounding neighborhood, whether that's crime rates, traffic counts, incivilities of that. There isn't a number in there for that. Where it does appear is in this, there is one modifier in there that's called design and ambiance. And it basically is where these, the ambiance of the surrounding community is assessed. I will say the tool is designed to be used by trained observers. So it's not that's why we do it. We don't give the tool to the Parks Department to do it without training them. We use it internally. So the idea is that a trained observer will assess this surrounding community in that modifier. And that modifier, actually, the design ambiance, has a real, compared to each individual component or some of the other modifiers for the whole site, does have a high value. So it's in there, but it's not in there in the way that you mentioned. And frankly, I think that is kind of a limitation of the measure. In use of it over all these years, I've come to realize that perception of safety, not just the objective safety, but perception of safety is probably one of the biggest variables, if not the biggest variable, in participation in going to parks. And it's not broken out specifically in this metric. So that could be a limitation of it.
Thanks, Robbie. Any last minute questions for Robbie? Otherwise, we can move on with our agenda. Just we've got about 8 minutes left. We can just try and do some quick updates of our projects and then kind of wrap up. So I guess I can start with our project where we're having potential triggering of HIPAA when providers refer physical activity outdoors to their patients. So this is the one where we're surveying about any kind of prescription to green space, to parks. And we have developed, our sub work group has developed a survey instrument that we want to now administer to park and recreation professionals, as well as healthcare professionals and public health professionals. And so we, one of the main focuses is like, are you familiar with these programs? How do you define these programs? So we're starting really from scratch, just in terms of how people associate to these programs. And so Carissa's been great. She got IRB approval for us through her institution. And we are now working with GP Red, and we're going to start by having them send out the survey to their membership. And that's going to be kind of our first step in terms of getting some data back. So the project is slowly but surely moving forward. Does anyone have any questions about any of that work? If not, Jay, I see you're on, so maybe you could give just a quick update on your project as well.
Sure. So this is the development of social cognitive measures for health and nature. So we did a nationwide survey, I think it's step 7, of 2,109 people from across the country who completed our survey. We are in the analysis phase right now and submitted the first abstract to the SHIFT conference already. So hopefully we'll have somewhere between 4 and 6 papers this fall.
That's great. And Terry's not on, and I don't have an update on her project at this time. Jem, I don't know if you do. Have you been able to get any information from her? No? Okay. All right. So so then we've got left, so let's kind of just try and wrap up. If anybody has ideas for a presenter for our next call, it'd be great if you could reach out to Jem. If you're interested in presenting some of your own research, please feel free to reach out to Jem with that as well. We don't have anyone currently scheduled, but we'll try and identify someone if no one has any ideas. And then I guess it's the open forum. So Jem, I guess I don't really understand what's written there. Do you know what Jeanette meant by that? Like, how can we improve? Are we talking about improving like our upcoming calls or work within the work group?
Yes, like our next presentation in the coming months.
Anyone?
Wonder too, did she have anything, was that also referring to kind of if we are still going to meet in the same schedule as we've been meeting monthly, or if we're going to be changing, or if we should change that in any way? If this Monday at noon still works every, like towards the end of every month?
Works for those of us that are here, right?
True.
Yeah.
If we want to know specifically for the whole group that's on the email list, maybe we could just send out a short survey asking if this is still the best day of the week and time to get everyone together.
Yeah, I think we'll do that. We can also ask if it still makes sense to meet monthly or if we want to go to every other month. Also, in terms of the information that that you get from these calls, is it useful? Does anyone have any suggestions on things that we might be missing that we should try and incorporate into our work group calls? Anything to improve it for you?
You know, I'll just throw in that I think having these calls has helped motivate our subgroup to get our survey moving forward, keep things moving forward, because we want to have something to report, right? And sound like we're actually doing something. So I think if anything, there's a value in having that sort of bar there, well, okay, what are we going to do before the next meeting?
We might
I
also
agree.
need to come back and kind of start thinking too about, are there any other projects that anybody would like to start or be a part of? It's been a while, I think, since we've talked. We've talked a lot about our ongoing projects and the 3 that we have ongoing right now, but there could be more room for other projects to be added on to these as well. So that might be something for a future date, future call.
Yeah, I guess I weigh in. I find these sessions valuable. I don't get to make all of them, but in a way, the fact there's more of them means I get more chances to participate. If I miss one, I haven't missed 6 months worth, whatever. So I'll vote for, let's just I like the way it works.
Okay, that's good to know. Thanks. We've got 2 minutes left. Any other last minute comments, ideas, thoughts for the group?
I've enjoyed having the presentations as well. The ones we've had have all been really good, I think.
Great. Thanks, Robby.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your presentation today, Robby. That was
Thank you.
really great information you gathered.
I sent the PDF to Jeanette and Jim, and you're welcome to forward that PDF of that presentation to everybody.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today, and have a good.
One quick question, Robby.
semester.
Have you
Oh, yeah.
published anything on GRASP?
Mostly in trade journals.
Okay.
The most comprehensive thing is those research briefs that just went out. Probably covers this particular presentation the best, but most of the public, most of it's been that. There was a little, perhaps something in that Courtney Schultz and I did something for the NRPA journal. I mean, the Parks and Recreation Journal. And it may have mentioned this, but it didn't go into detail. So no, not really, other than in various trade things. Because this really is a tool for practice more than research. I think it has application or can inform research, but it's really been developed not as rigorously, I'll say, as a research tool, would be more for practical application.
Thank you.
Mhm.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. And I guess good luck with the start of the semester, and we'll talk to you in a month.
All right, thank you. Bye, everybody. Thanks again, everybody.